For nearly a century, the eastern edge of southern Africa burned with a slow, relentless conflict that most of the world barely noticed, yet it shaped the fate of an entire people and redrew the map of South Africa forever. Long before formal declarations of war, before uniforms and flags made violence look organized, the Cape Frontier Wars began as quiet pressure on land, cattle, and survival. In the late 18th century, the Eastern Cape was not an empty frontier but a living landscape shaped by the rhythms of coarser agricultural and pastoral life, where cattle were wealth, status, and security, and land was held through complex systems of kinship, custom, and seasonal movement. To the west, Dutch-speaking colonists of the Cape Colony were expanding steadily outward, driven by economic hunger, population growth, and a colonial system that rewarded those who could claim and control grazing land. Between these two worlds lay the Zuurveld, a fertile but contested region between the Great Fish and Beesman's rivers, and it was here that misunderstanding hardened into hostility and trade disputes turned into warfare. At first, the conflict was not framed as a struggle between civilizations but as a series of disputes over cattle theft, grazing rights, and authority. Cattle were the backbone of both economies, but for very different reasons. For the colonists, cattle meant trade, market value, and survival in a harsh frontier economy tied to imperial interests. For the Xhosa, cattle were deeply woven into social life, marriage systems, ritual practices, and political power. When Xhosa chiefdoms, under pressure from population growth and ecological strain east of the Great K River, began moving westward into the Zuurveld, they did not see themselves as invaders but as communities following long-established patterns of seasonal movement. The colonists, however, saw this movement as a direct threat to private property and colonial order. The Cape government, distant and often weak, failed to create clear boundaries or enforce fair systems of negotiation, allowing fear and resentment to grow on both sides. The First Cape Frontier War erupted in 1779, not as a planned campaign but as a breakdown of fragile coexistence. Frontier farmers accused Xhosa groups of cattle raiding, while Xhosa leaders argued that colonists were encroaching illegally on grazing land and disrupting traditional routes. Raids and counter-raids followed, with small commandos clashing with Xhosa warriors in a cycle of retaliation that neither side could fully control. The war ended without decisive victory, setting a dangerous precedent. Violence could pause tensions, but it could not resolve them. When similar disputes resurfaced in 1793, the Second War followed almost the same pattern, reinforcing mistrust and hardening attitudes. Each conflict made compromise less likely, as losses mounted and memories of betrayal spread through oral histories and frontier tales. By the time the Third War broke out in 1799, the frontier had become a powder keg. This conflict was more serious and more destabilizing than those before it, because it expanded beyond simple clashes between colonists and Xhosa chiefdoms. Khorasan Laboris, long exploited by white settlers and subjected to harsh control, rose up alongside the Xhosa, deserting farms and taking firearms and horses with them. This uprising exposed deep fractures within colonial society itself and terrified settlers, who now feared rebellion from both outside and within. The war dragged on until 1801, draining resources and leaving large areas devastated, yet once again it ended in stalemate. Neither side achieved lasting security, and the land remained contested, scarred by violence and uncertainty. Behind these early wars lay political forces that extended far beyond the Eastern Cape. The Cape Colony was not an independent power but a pawn in European struggles, especially during the Napoleonic Wars. Control of the Cape was strategically vital for trade routes between Europe and Asia, and British forces occupied the colony to prevent it from falling into French hands. This shift in imperial authority transformed the frontier conflict. Where the Dutch colonial administration had been limited in military capacity, the British brought professional troops, centralized command, and a growing belief in imperial expansion as both a moral and strategic necessity. To British officials, frontier instability threatened not only settlers but imperial prestige and security. In 1811, this new imperial mindset erupted into the Fourth Cape Frontier War. British forces marched east with a clear objective: to remove the Xhosa from the Zuurveld entirely and secure the frontier once and for all. Unlike earlier wars, this campaign was systematic and overwhelming. Villages were destroyed, crops burned, and cattle seized, forcing Xhosa communities to retreat east of the Great Fish River. Thousands were displaced, families scattered, and traditional economic systems shattered. For the British and the colonists, This appeared to be a decisive victory, but it was achieved at immense human cost. The removal of the Xhosa did not create peace, it created desperation. As Xhosa communities regrouped east of the frontier, internal tensions grew, fueled by overcrowding and competition for resources. These pressures exploded in the War of 1818 to 1819, which involved not only fighting between the British and the Xhosa but also violent conflicts within Xhosa society itself. Leaders such as Ndlam and the prophetic figure Makana emerged as symbols of resistance, blending spiritual authority with political defiance. Makana's call to resist colonial domination electrified many followers, offering hope that spiritual power could counter British guns. Yet the British response was swift and brutal, crushing organized resistance and capturing Makana, who later died attempting to escape imprisonment. After this war, the land between the Great Fish and Keiskamma rivers was declared neutral, later described as ceded, though in reality it was taken through force rather than consent. British authorities attempted to clear the area of its Xhosa inhabitants, but removal proved nearly impossible, as people continued to return to ancestral lands. At the same time, the region became even more unstable due to the arrival of Mfengu refugees fleeing the chaos of the Mafeking in Natal. These displaced groups, combined with the settlement of British colonists in 1820, intensified competition for land and deepened divisions. What had begun as localized disputes over cattle and grazing had evolved into a prolonged struggle over sovereignty, identity, and survival, setting the stage for decades of bloodshed still to come. The uneasy calm that followed the British expulsion of the Xhosa from the Zuurveld was not peace but a tense pause, filled with hunger, overcrowding, and unresolved injustice. East of the Great Fish River, Xhosa communities were compressed into shrinking territories that could no longer sustain their cattle herds or farming cycles. Land that had once allowed seasonal movement was now restricted by artificial borders enforced with rifles and patrols. The British administration believed that firm boundaries would prevent future conflict, yet those boundaries ignored the realities of African land use and social organization. As cattle numbers declined and grazing land disappeared, desperation grew, and desperation made war inevitable. The arrival of Mfengu refugees, fleeing devastation caused by the Mafeking, added another layer of complexity. These displaced people sought protection under British authority, and in return many became allies of the colonial state, a decision that would later deepen divisions among African communities and intensify the violence of future wars. Throughout the 1820s and 1830s, the frontier simmered with low-level conflict, cattle raids, and punitive expeditions that rarely made headlines but steadily eroded trust. British officials increasingly framed the Xhosa not as neighboring peoples with legitimate claims, but as obstacles to progress and order. This mindset justified harsher policies, including forced removals, military patrols, and the establishment of mission stations intended to reshape African society along European lines. For the Xhosa, these missions represented both refuge and threat, places of food and protection during famine, but also instruments of cultural erosion and political control. The struggle was no longer just about land, it was about identity, authority, and the right to exist on one's own terms. The Sixth Cape Frontier War, erupting in 1834, marked a dramatic escalation in scale and brutality. Sparked by the killing of a Xhosa chief and retaliatory cattle raids, the conflict exploded into widespread violence along the frontier. Xhosa forces crossed the Great Fish River in large numbers, attacking farms and settlements with speed and coordination, reclaiming cattle and land they believed had been unjustly taken. For many colonists, this assault confirmed their worst fears and reinforced the belief that coexistence was impossible. British forces responded with overwhelming force, launching deep incursions into Xhosa territory, destroying homesteads, burning crops, and seizing livestock on a massive scale. Entire communities were left destitute, and famine followed closely behind the fighting. The human cost of this war was devastating. Thousands of Xhosa men, women, and children died not only from violence but from starvation and disease brought on by displacement. Colonial losses were smaller in number but politically significant, fueling demands for stronger military control and permanent occupation of Xhosa lands. The war ended in 1836 with yet another uneasy settlement, but this time the consequences were far-reaching. Large areas of Xhosa territory were annexed, and the frontier moved steadily eastward. The British government appointed administrators with broad powers, and the region was increasingly governed through military authority rather than negotiation. Yet even as the colonial grip tightened, resistance did not disappear. Instead, it transformed. Xhosa society, fractured by loss and pressure, turned increasingly to spiritual explanations for their suffering. Prophets and visionaries gained influence, offering hope that supernatural intervention could restore balance and drive out the colonizers. This spiritual resistance reached its most tragic expression in the cattle-killing movement of 1856 to 1857. A young prophetess, Nonkawas, proclaimed that if the Xhosa destroyed their cattle and crops, the spirits of their ancestors would rise, sweep away the Europeans, and usher in an age of abundance. Desperate, hungry, and traumatized by decades of war, many believed her message. The result was catastrophic. As tens of thousands of cattle were slaughtered and fields left unplanted, famine spread with terrifying speed. When the promised resurrection did not occur, Xhosa society collapsed under the weight of starvation. Historians estimate that up to 40,000 Xhosa people died, and countless others were forced to seek work on colonial farms or in towns to survive. This disaster did more to break organized Xhosa resistance than any military campaign. The British authorities, while not the architects of the prophecy, exploited its aftermath to consolidate control, claiming abandoned lands and accelerating the incorporation of Xhosa territories into the colonial economy. Despite this collapse, conflict did not entirely cease. The frontier wars continued intermittently into the latter half of the 19th century, as smaller uprisings flared in response to forced labor, taxation, and land seizures. Each confrontation followed a familiar pattern: resistance born of injustice, followed by crushing retaliation, followed by further loss of autonomy. By the time the final Cape Frontier War ended in 1879, after a century of struggle, the Xhosa had lost not only their land but their political independence. Their territories were annexed, their leaders subordinated to colonial rule, and their people absorbed into a system designed to serve imperial interests. What makes the Cape Frontier Wars especially haunting is not just their length or brutality, but their slow, grinding nature. There was no single decisive battle, no clear moment of victory or defeat, only a steady erosion of a people's ability to resist. Politics, economics, and military power combined to produce an outcome that seemed inevitable in hindsight, yet was experienced by those who lived through it as a series of painful choices, betrayals, and shattered hopes. The frontier became a place where fear ruled daily life, where survival depended on shifting alliances and impossible decisions, and where the cost of empire was paid in blood, hunger, and loss that echoed across generations. By the mid-19th century, the Eastern Cape Frontier had been transformed into a landscape shaped by exhaustion and control, yet beneath the surface, resentment continued to burn. The aftermath of the cattle-killing catastrophe left Xhosa society profoundly weakened, but it did not erase memory or injustice. Survivors were scattered, many forced into wage labor on white-owned farms, road-building projects, or military service under colonial command. British authorities viewed this outcome as proof of successful pacification, but in reality it was the creation of a deeply unequal system built on coercion and dependency. Land that had once sustained independent communities was now parceled out to settlers, mission stations, and loyal African allies, while Xhosa families struggled to survive on shrinking reserves under strict colonial supervision. Politically, the Cape government increasingly justified its expansion through the language of order and civilization. Frontier wars were no longer framed as defensive reactions but as necessary measures to impose stability on what officials described as a violent and backward borderland. This rhetoric masked the economic motivations driving expansion. Wool farming, commercial agriculture, and trade required secure land and cheap labor, both of which were extracted from Xhosa defeat. Every new conflict produced fresh opportunities for annexation, taxation, and labor control. For the Xhosa, resistance became more fragmented, shifting from large-scale warfare to localized uprisings, cattle raids, and acts of defiance that were quickly labeled criminal rather than political. The 7th and 8th Frontier Wars reflected this shift. These conflicts were shorter, more contained, yet intensely destructive for local communities. Colonial forces, now experienced in frontier warfare, relied on scorched earth tactics refined over decades. Homesteads were burned not as a byproduct of war but as a strategy to break resistance by targeting food supplies and shelter. Cattle seizures remained central, stripping families of their economic foundation and social identity. While colonial casualties remained relatively low due to superior weaponry and logistics, African losses were devastating. Death came not only from gunfire but from exposure, hunger, and disease in the weeks and months that followed military campaigns. Leadership within Xhosa society faced impossible choices. Some chiefs attempted to negotiate accommodation, hoping to preserve remnants of autonomy by cooperating with colonial authorities. Others rejected compromise, believing that submission would mean cultural extinction. These divisions weakened collective resistance and allowed the colonial state to play rivals against one another. Chiefs who aligned with the government were rewarded with recognition and limited authority, while opponents were deposed, exiled, or killed. Traditional systems of governance were steadily dismantled and replaced with colonial magistrates and regulations that answered to Cape Town rather than local custom. At the same time, British settlers and officials increasingly demanded permanent security. Frontier farmers, hardened by generations of violence, pushed for total annexation and the complete removal of African political power. Newspapers, petitions, and parliamentary debates portrayed the Xhosa as an endless threat that could only be neutralized through firm control. This pressure influenced colonial policy, leading to the gradual absorption of independent African territories into the Cape Colony. Each annexation was presented as a final solution, yet each merely shifted the frontier further east, ensuring that conflict would follow. The Ninth Frontier War, beginning in 1877, unfolded in a region already stretched to its breaking point. By now, the Xhosa faced not only British authority but a colonial system backed by decades of infrastructure, alliances, and military experience. The war erupted amid broader regional instability, as southern Africa became increasingly entangled in imperial competition. Railways, telegraph lines, and supply networks allowed colonial forces to mobilize faster and strike deeper than ever before. Resistance, though courageous, was uneven and poorly supplied. Xhosa fighters relied on intimate knowledge of terrain and hit-and-run tactics, but they were increasingly outmatched by modern rifles and coordinated campaigns. The human cost of this final phase was severe. Villages were cleared, livestock confiscated, and thousands of people displaced once again. Estimates suggest that entire districts were depopulated as families fled or were forcibly removed. Colonial forces suffered losses as well, but these were dwarfed by African casualties and the long-term destruction of social structures. When the war ended in 1879, it marked not just the conclusion of a conflict but the end of an era. The last remaining Xhosa territories were annexed, and their people were officially incorporated into the Cape Colony, subject to colonial law, taxation, and labor demands. What followed was a slow, quiet violence that replaced open warfare. Pass laws, land acts, and labor contracts restricted movement and opportunity, ensuring that resistance would be economic and social rather than military. The frontier wars faded from public attention, but their legacy shaped every aspect of life in the region. Land ownership patterns, racial hierarchies, and systems of exploitation established during this century of conflict laid foundations that would later harden into apartheid. The Cape Frontier Wars were not an isolated chapter but a prolonged process of conquest whose consequences extended far beyond the battlefield. For the Xhosa, survival itself became an act of resistance. Language, ritual, and memory preserved stories of loss and courage, passed down through generations who had never known independence but remembered it through inherited trauma. For the colonial state, victory came at the cost of moral contradiction, as ideals of civilization were enforced through destruction and dispossession. The frontier, once a place of shared resources and negotiation, had become a line of domination. The war had ended, but its echoes continued to shape South African history, embedding inequality into the land itself and ensuring that the struggle over justice and identity would continue long after the guns fell silent. Even after the final shots of open warfare faded, the true consequences of the Cape Frontier Wars unfolded in ways that were quieter but no less destructive. The annexation of Xhosa territories did not bring reconciliation or equality. It marked the beginning of a new phase of domination where law replaced the rifle but served the same purpose. Colonial administrators moved quickly to formalize control, imposing taxes that forced African households into the cash economy and labor market. Land, once held collectively through custom and kinship, was surveyed, registered, and claimed under European legal systems that excluded most Xhosa people by design. What had been taken by force in war was now secured by paperwork, courts, and bureaucratic power. For many Xhosa families, survival depended on submitting to a system that offered little choice. Men were compelled to work on farms, in towns, or on colonial infrastructure projects, often under harsh conditions and low pay. Women and children bore the burden of maintaining households with reduced access to land and resources. Traditional agricultural cycles were disrupted, leading to chronic food insecurity that lingered for decades. Cattle, once central to economic and spiritual life, were no longer a reliable foundation for independence. The wars had not only seized territory, they had dismantled an entire way of life, replacing it with enforced dependency. Politically, the destruction of independent Xhosa authority was complete. Chiefs who had once governed through consensus and tradition now operated under colonial supervision, their powers limited and conditional. Some attempted to use the system to protect their people, navigating colonial law to secure land or reduce taxes, but their authority was constantly undermined. Others were removed or ignored entirely, replaced by magistrates who knew little of local customs and cared even less. This erosion of leadership fractured communities and weakened collective resistance, ensuring that challenges to colonial rule would be isolated and easily suppressed. The psychological impact of a century of warfare was profound. Generations had grown up knowing nothing but instability, loss, and fear. Stories of burned villages, fallen leaders, and broken promises were woven into oral history, shaping identity and memory. For the colonists, the frontier wars reinforced a culture of suspicion and racial hierarchy, justifying inequality as a necessary response to what they portrayed as perpetual threat. This mutual distrust hardened into social division, making reconciliation increasingly distant. The frontier had taught both sides to see the other not as neighbors, but as enemies. Economically, the Eastern Cape was transformed into a resource base for colonial expansion. Wool, crops, and labor flowed westward, enriching settlers and feeding imperial markets. Roads and ports built on African labor connected the region to global trade networks, while African communities remained trapped at the bottom of the economic ladder. The profits of conquest were unevenly distributed, and the costs were borne almost entirely by those who had lost the war. This imbalance was not accidental but structural, designed to ensure long-term control and prevent any return to independence. Culturally, resistance adapted rather than disappeared. Songs, rituals, and ceremonies preserved memories of leaders like Ndlam and Makana, keeping alive a sense of identity that colonial rule could not erase. Mission education, while intended to reshape African values, also produced a generation of literate Xhosa thinkers who would later challenge injustice through new forms of resistance. The legacy of the frontier wars thus contained a contradiction. While they crushed military opposition, they planted the seeds of political awareness and future struggle. The British Empire, confident in its victory, rarely reflected on the moral cost of its success. Official records emphasized order restored and progress achieved, overlooking the devastation left behind. Yet the frontier wars exposed the limits of imperial ideals. Claims of civilization clashed with realities of forced removals, famine, and cultural destruction. The Cape Frontier Wars became an early example of how empire expanded not through a single decisive conquest, but through prolonged pressure that wore down resistance over generations. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Eastern Cape stood as a warning and a foundation. It was a warning of what happened when expansion ignored justice and humanity, and a foundation for the racialized systems of governance that would later dominate South Africa. The wars had ended on paper, but their outcomes shaped laws, land ownership, and social relations well into the future. What had begun as disputes over cattle and grazing had evolved into one of the longest and most consequential struggles against European intrusion in African history, leaving scars that time alone could not heal. The end of the Cape Frontier Wars in 1879 did not arrive with a sense of closure or justice, but with silence, exhaustion, and the quiet normalization of loss. After 100 years of intermittent warfare, the Eastern Cape was no longer a frontier in the old sense. It had been fully absorbed into the Cape Colony, its people bound by colonial law and its land reorganized to serve imperial interests. For the Xhosa, this moment marked not peace, but the confirmation of a long-feared reality. Independence had been stripped away through a slow war of attrition in which military defeat, famine, and political manipulation worked together to crush resistance. The battlefield had shifted from open conflict to daily survival under a system designed without their consent. In the years that followed annexation, the legacy of the wars became visible in every aspect of life. Communities that once governed themselves were now subject to passes, permits, and taxes that regulated movement and labor. Young men left their homes to work on farms, in ports, and later in mines, while families were left fractured and vulnerable. Land that had been cultivated for generations was no longer theirs to control, and overcrowding in designated areas led to recurring hunger and disease. These conditions were not accidental outcomes of war, they were the continuation of its logic, ensuring that the conquered population remained economically dependent and politically powerless. The human cost of the Cape Frontier Wars is difficult to measure precisely, but its scale is undeniable. Tens of thousands of Xhosa lives were lost directly through combat, famine, and displacement, while countless others suffered long-term trauma and poverty. Colonial losses, though smaller, shaped policy and hardened attitudes, reinforcing a belief that force was the only language the frontier understood. Entire generations grew up within a cycle of fear and retaliation, where trust was impossible and compromise was seen as weakness. This prolonged violence left no clear victors, only survivors and beneficiaries of conquest. Yet history is not only written in defeat. The Xhosa people endured, preserving language, culture, and memory despite overwhelming pressure to conform or disappear. Their survival stands as quiet testimony to resilience in the face of sustained injustice. The wars that sought to erase autonomy instead became a source of historical consciousness, remembered as a warning against dispossession and domination. In later years, descendants of those who lived through the frontier wars would draw upon these memories to challenge inequality and demand recognition, proving that conquest could never fully extinguish identity. For the colonial state, the Cape Frontier Wars served as both a blueprint and a lesson. The methods refined along the eastern Cape Frontier, land seizure, indirect rule, labor control, and divide-and-rule politics, would be applied elsewhere in southern Africa. These conflicts revealed how empire expanded not through decisive victories alone, but through persistence, bureaucracy, and the exploitation of vulnerability. The consequences extended far beyond the 19th century, shaping political structures that would later harden into institutionalized racial segregation. Understanding the Cape Frontier Wars means confronting uncomfortable truths about power, progress, and resistance. It requires recognizing that history is not only made by empires and armies, but by communities struggling to protect their land, culture, and future. These wars remind us that colonial expansion was not inevitable or uncontested, but fiercely resisted over generations. They stand as one of the longest and most determined struggles by African peoples against European intrusion, a conflict whose impact still echoes in modern South Africa. If you found this story informative and believe our videos are helping you understand real history without distortion, support our work by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and pressing the bell notification button so you never miss our latest war history series. Your support helps keep these stories alive and ensures that the lessons of the past continue to reach audiences who seek the truth behind history's greatest conflicts.